Hello, my dear viewers, and thank you for taking the time to join me today. My name is Teresa, and I'm sitting here on this peaceful porch in Burlington, Vermont, with the cool breeze of the Green Mountains brushing my face. At 78 years old, I've lived through many chapters in my life, some I wish I could forget, and others I hold dearly. But today, I want to open my heart and share a story that's been buried deep within me for more than 50 years. A story of love, betrayal, pain, and ultimately survival. It's a story I've kept locked away for so long, but I've realized that sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that need to be told the most. Before I dive into the details, I want to thank each and every one of you for supporting this channel. Your encouragement means more to me than you might know. We've reached 30,000 subscribers, and to celebrate, we're holding a special giveaway. A $1,000 prize to one lucky subscriber. To enter, simply like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment telling me a little about you. Where are you watching from? How many children and grandchildren do you have? What's your favorite way to spend your free time? I love hearing from you all, and it truly warms my heart to see this community grow. But now, let's take a step back together to 1955, a year that shaped the person I am today. It's where this story began, in Lexington, Kentucky, on a quiet, sunny street with a small corner house surrounded by gardens and picket fences. For many, it might sound like the ideal place for a peaceful childhood, and to an extent it was. But like many of us, the perfect exterior hid a far deeper story. A story of hidden struggles, heartache, and a longing for love that would change everything. Growing up as the only child in a modest home, I thought of myself as lucky to have both parents, even though they weren't perfect. My father, Samuel, was a quiet, hard-working man who worked as an accountant in a local textile factory. And my mother, Martha, well, she was the heart of our home. The days were simple and filled with love. Sunday afternoons meant spaghetti with chicken, my father's favorite meal, and my mother's homemade apple pie. It was a life full of small, beautiful moments. But as life often shows us, what seems perfect from the outside isn't always as it seems. This story starts with a knock on our door. 3 sharp, firm knocks that would forever change the course of my life. That was the day my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, stepped into our home for the first time. He was a man of few words, but those words carried weight, and his presence, like a looming shadow, would soon dominate every corner of our lives. As I think back to that day, the sound of those knocks still echoes in my mind. My father's reaction, the sudden shift in the air when that man entered our home, and the cold, calculating gaze that swept over us all. It was clear then that our lives would never be the same. The man who had never been much more than a distant figure in my life had suddenly become the force that would shape it in ways I couldn't yet understand. But what I did understand that day was this. Sometimes life has a way of changing things. Sometimes it's a single moment, a single person, a single choice that shapes the rest of your story. This is mine. So let's begin. I'm ready to share it all, the good, the bad, and everything in between. I hope by the end of this journey, you'll find a piece of your own story here. Because no matter where we come from or what we face, we all have something to share. And that's what makes us stronger. Stay with me, dear ones. The story is just beginning. There's something so precious about the simplicity of childhood. It's a time when the world feels small, safe, and predictable. Looking back on those early years in Lexington, Kentucky, it feels like I lived in a world where everything had its place. A world where the rhythms of everyday life provided a sense of security. My home was a small, modest corner house with a garden that my mother, Martha, took great pride in. Every spring, the colorful dahlias she planted would bloom proudly, greeting anyone who passed by. It wasn't much, but it was ours. A place filled with love, even if the world outside didn't always see it that way. I was my parents' miracle child, born after my mother had lost 3 pregnancies before me. She always said it was God's gift to her, a little miracle that she held close every day. My father, Samuel, worked as an accountant at the local textile factory. He wasn't a man of many words but had a quiet, steady presence. After a long day at work, you could always find him on the porch, reading the newspaper with his transistor radio playing softly in the background, broadcasting Cincinnati Reds games. It was this steady, comforting routine that made our home feel like a safe haven, a place where small joys filled our days. The mornings were simple. My father would wake up early to head to the factory, and my mother would start her day with a hot cup of coffee brewing on the wood stove. The kitchen smelled like cornbread, and it always felt like home. I'd walk to school every day carrying my little vinyl satchel, the one my father had given me on my first day. I didn't know it then, but that satchel would become a symbol of a time when life seemed so simple, when my biggest worry was whether I'd pass my spelling test, or if Mrs. Margaret would lend me another book to read. School was my escape from the limitations of our small house. I excelled in my studies, especially in English and history. I loved the adventure stories, the tales of distant lands and brave knights, and I imagined myself in those stories. I always dreamed of becoming a teacher like Mrs. Margaret, who encouraged me to read more, write better, and reach further. She was the first person who made me feel like I could be something greater than the quiet girl from a small town. Sundays were always a highlight in our week. We'd attend service at First Baptist Church, and afterward it was the same comforting routine. Spaghetti with chicken for dinner, my father's favorite. We didn't have much, but we had enough to get by. As a child, I never felt the weight of the world. I was wrapped in a bubble of love, with my father and mother always there, supporting me in their quiet ways. It's funny to think about how small things back then brought such joy. Sundays in church, walks down the street with my father, or the simple smell of my mother's apple pie filling the house after dinner. Yet, as much as I loved the simplicity of those days, there was always something in the air that felt like it was building toward a change. There was a hidden tension that I didn't fully understand. My father was always a man of few words, and though he provided for us, there were moments when I could see the weight of the world on his shoulders. As the years went by, I would begin to see more clearly how his relationship with my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, had affected him in ways that no child should ever have to understand. But for now, I was just a girl, caught in the world of my small Kentucky town, dreaming of what could be. One of the lessons I learned from those days was the quiet strength that comes from simplicity. There's beauty in the routine, the little moments, the ordinary acts of love that build a life. And in a world that can often seem chaotic, it's those moments of stillness, of family dinners, of quiet walks to school, that anchor you. They give you the foundation to stand strong when life inevitably changes, as it always does. But as I would soon discover, even the simplest lives are not immune to disruption. And in 1955, that disruption was just around the corner, waiting to knock on our door. The arrival of my grandfather would be the beginning of a chapter that would forever change the course of my life. A chapter one hadn't yet fully understood. But for now, the world was still simple. The smell of cornbread in the oven, the sound of my father's radio in the background, and the endless possibilities of a childhood filled with dreams. That simplicity would soon collide with the harsh reality of a world I had yet to know. But for now, it was a quiet Sunday and everything felt right. And maybe that was the lesson I needed. Sometimes you can't see the storm coming until it's too late. Sometimes you just have to hold on to the good things while they last. Now let's move on to the next chapter. When everything changed, and my world was no longer the peaceful place I had always known. But first, let me take a moment to remember the good, because we'll need that strength when we reach the darkest part of this story. The day my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, arrived in our lives is one I'll never forget. It was a typical Sunday, or at least it started out that way. The sun was shining brightly, and the scent of my mother's cooking filled the air. We had just finished a simple Sunday lunch of spaghetti with chicken, which was my father's favorite. It was a peaceful routine, one I had come to cherish deeply. But as soon as the knock came at the door, I felt something shift in the air. It wasn't a friendly knock, but the kind of knock that demanded attention, the kind you feel in your bones before you even open the door. When my father answered, I saw a look on his face I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and surprise. He stood there, stiff as a board, greeting the man at the door with a level of respect that was both foreign and unsettling to me. The man who entered was tall, with sharply cut gray hair, a military posture, and eyes as cold as winter. His presence in our home was overwhelming. He didn't look at me with the same warmth my father had. No, instead, he sized me up, his eyes scanning me like I was some sort of project. "Samuel," he said in a voice that was commanding and devoid of any warmth, "I've come to see how you're raising my granddaughter." I remember the way my father's shoulders slumped slightly. My father, who had always been so quiet but steady, suddenly seemed like a child again, trying to prove himself to this towering figure. My grandfather, Colonel Forest, wasn't just a man. He was an institution. a force of nature that seemed to control every room he walked into. He made it clear that his visit wasn't out of curiosity or affection. He was here to inspect, to judge. And his judgment, as I would come to learn, was final. I stood frozen, watching the man's cold eyes sweep over me. When he spoke to me, it wasn't with kindness, but as if I was a specimen to be examined. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Teresa, sir," I answered, my voice trembling slightly, though I didn't know why. He didn't smile, didn't offer a word of encouragement. Instead, he looked me up and down and nodded with a clinical, almost dismissive gesture. Then, he asked about my grades, my performance in school. I answered nervously, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. The praise I received from my teacher seemed insignificant to him. "Is she learning discipline?" he asked my father, ignoring me entirely. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a man who had come to control, to remind us all of who he was and what he expected from us. He brought with him a gift for me, a porcelain doll dressed in velvet, but even this gesture was laced with a dark undertone. His words as he handed it to me made it clear. A girl must learn to be delicate like porcelain but strong inside. My mother, Martha, tried to make small talk, offering coffee and cake, but it was clear she wasn't in control here. My grandfather dominated every conversation, every moment. His presence loomed like a shadow over our house, and every word he spoke carried an unspoken threat. That night, after he left, I could feel the change in the air. My parents were no longer themselves. My father, who had always been the calm and collected figure in our house, seemed smaller, weaker in his father's presence. I remember asking him, "Why is Grandpa so stern, Dad?" His response was something I would carry with me for years. "Sometimes, Teresa, fear isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's just good sense. Fear." That was the lesson my grandfather was teaching us. And it was a lesson that would continue to shape my life in the coming years. As time went on, the visits became more frequent. My grandfather's influence over my father deepened, and the respect he commanded turned into fear. Fear of his judgment, fear of his expectations. Little by little, our peaceful home, once filled with the warmth of my mother's cooking and my father's quiet presence, began to feel like a place under siege. The lesson here, even at a young age, was clear: power could be wielded quietly, with a chilling efficiency. Control wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was the subtle, everyday actions, the criticisms, the silent judgments that held the most power. But there was more to come. The growing tension in our house was only the beginning of what I would soon face. And soon life would bring another man into my life, Arnold. Someone who promised the light at the end of the tunnel, but who would turn out to be yet another figure of control in my young life. That's when things started to shift for me, and the hope I felt from meeting him would slowly begin to turn into an illusion. But first, let me tell you more about the man who would change everything, who would initially appear to be my rescuer. As the weeks passed after my grandfather's first visit, it became clear that his presence in our home wasn't just a one-time event. It wasn't even a mere family reunion. My grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, had entered our lives with the force of a military campaign, and it felt as though our home was becoming a battlefield. His visits, once a rarity, soon became a weekly affair. Every Sunday, without fail, he would appear at our door, his sharp gray suit and polished shoes a constant reminder of his authority. At first, the visits felt like a strange form of discipline, almost like an inspection, but over time they morphed into something more oppressive. His criticisms grew sharper, his expectations higher. Nothing in our home escaped his scrutiny, not the way my mother set the table, not the cleanliness of the house, and certainly not me. Each visit felt like another weight added to my shoulders, another expectation I would never be able to meet. My grandfather's gaze was unyielding, and his sharp words had a way of cutting through the air, leaving behind a silence so heavy, it was almost suffocating. I remember one evening in particular. My grandfather arrived earlier than expected. I had been playing with my dolls in the living room, a small escape from the growing tension, when I heard his car pull up outside. My mother, who was always anxious about his visits, hurriedly began tidying the house, checking and rechecking every corner as if trying to make everything perfect. She was always trying to prove something to him, always trying to gain his approval. It was as though no matter how much she did, it was never enough. When he walked through the door, I could feel the shift in the room. My father, who had always been calm and steady, shrunk under his father's glare. The man who had once been the rock of our family now seemed like a shell of himself, nervous and resigned. It was in these moments that I saw my father, an accountant, a man who had worked hard to provide for our family, reduced to a boy once again, trying to gain his father's approval. One evening, after we had finished dinner, my grandfather insisted on reviewing my school notebooks. He flipped through them, his sharp eyes scanning every page, his finger pointing out every imperfection. "This handwriting is unacceptable," he said, his voice like steel. "A Forest doesn't write like this." I could feel my cheeks burning as I sat there, silently listening to his harsh judgment. Every word he spoke felt like a small knife twisting in my chest. At the same time, I couldn't help but notice how my mother looked at him, almost as though she feared him, as though she knew that his approval was a matter of life or death. Her nervous laughter and anxious apologies made it clear that she had never truly escaped his control, even after all these years. As a child, I didn't fully understand it, but I could feel the suffocating pressure he put on us all, especially her. One of the most difficult parts of living under my grandfather's roof was the subtle way he used control. It wasn't always direct. Sometimes it was the silence, the unspoken rules, the tension in the air. He didn't need to shout. His mere presence was enough to make you feel small, insignificant. And even though my parents tried their best to shield me from his cruelty, I began to see that their own fear of him shaped everything in our lives. I remember one day after a particularly tense dinner, when my grandfather had criticized my mother for not serving the food hot enough, I asked my father why he let his father treat us like this. His response was quiet, almost reluctant. "Sometimes, Teresa, fear isn't cowardice. Sometimes it's just good sense." It was a hard truth to swallow. Fear had become so ingrained in our lives that it felt like a normal part of the fabric of our family. I began to question myself, was I meant to live in fear forever? Was I always going to feel small in my own home, a home that no longer felt like mine? But even in the midst of all this fear, there were small moments of resistance. My mother, despite the fear that consumed her, would try to maintain some normalcy. She would tell me stories at bedtime, even when my grandfather's presence in the house loomed over us like a dark cloud. She would bake my favorite apple pie, and for a moment, it was as if we could forget everything that was happening around us. But these moments were fleeting. The shadow of my grandfather's control always returned. Living under his roof meant living in a constant state of tension. I had to watch every word I spoke, every movement I made. His eyes were always on me, judging, evaluating. I started to wonder if I would ever be free of this oppressive grip, this relentless control that overshadowed every aspect of my life. Little did I know, the storm that was brewing in our house would soon change everything. As the weeks turned into months, my grandfather's visits became more frequent, and his control more suffocating. But there was something else happening in my life. A new figure was emerging. Arnold, the man who had first made me feel special, now appeared in my life as a source of comfort. But soon I would learn that even he too would bring more illusions than promises. The hope I had placed in him would start to unravel, and I would discover that the road to freedom was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. It was at this point, under the weight of my grandfather's control and the illusion of safety Arnold represented, that I began to see that the fight for my future wasn't going to be easy. It was going to require more courage than I ever thought I had. The real challenge was just beginning. As a child, I often found myself seeking solace in my mother's arms, hoping that her gentle touch would shield me from the chaos that had begun to dominate our home. Martha, my mother, had always been my source of comfort, my protector from the world outside. But as my grandfather's influence seeped deeper into our lives, I began to question whether her support was truly an act of love, or if, in some ways, it was a form of complicity. Martha had always been the heart of our home. I remember the warmth of her hands as she kneaded dough on cold mornings, or the way her laughter would fill the room when she told me stories before bed. She had a quiet strength, one that held our family together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Her love for my father, despite his many flaws, was clear. She stood by him, supported him, and did everything in her power to maintain peace in our home. But peace came at a cost, one that I began to understand as I grew older. When my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, entered our lives with his relentless authority, my mother's role shifted. No longer was she the loving, nurturing figure I had always known. Instead, she became a woman torn between her duty to her father and her love for her family. I could see the conflict in her eyes during those Sunday dinners, when she would smile nervously and apologize for things that didn't need apologizing. She'd smooth her apron over and over, trying to make everything perfect, trying to please him in a way that was suffocating. It wasn't long before I realized that her fear of my grandfather was just as real as mine, though she tried desperately to hide it. I remember one evening when my grandfather, after a long day of criticism, insisted on seeing my school notebooks. I had grown accustomed to his harsh judgments, but that evening was different. My mother, usually so composed, was visibly shaking as she watched him flip through my notebooks, marking every small error with a scowl. She said nothing, just watched from the corner of the room, her eyes filled with silent pleading. In that moment I began to wonder, was she really supporting me by staying silent, or was she complicit in the system of control that my grandfather had instilled in our home? Her silence was not one of ignorance. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen the power my grandfather held over us all, and yet she chose to remain passive. Perhaps it was the fear of him, perhaps it was a resignation born from years of living under his shadow, but she did not protect me in the way I had always hoped she would. One day, when my grandfather had gone home after a particularly cruel visit, I mustered up the courage to confront her. "Why don't you say something when he criticizes me, when he makes me feel so small?" I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. My mother, who had never been one for confrontation, looked at me with a sadness in her eyes that I had never seen before. "Sometimes, Teresa," she said softly, "you don't understand the price of speaking up. He's my father. I can't fight him without risking everything. Our lives, our home, your father's job. Some things are bigger than us." Her words stung, and I realized then that she wasn't simply silent out of fear for me, but out of fear for all of us. My grandfather had a power that extended beyond the walls of our home. He could ruin lives, destroy reputations, and cripple careers with just a word. And my mother, in her quiet way, was trying to shield us from that wrath, even if it meant silently tolerating his cruelty. But was this truly the best choice? Could silence really protect us? As I thought about it more, I began to see that her silence was not just a survival mechanism. It was also a way of accepting her own place in our family's dysfunction. She had lived under my grandfather's thumb for so long that she had come to believe that there was no other way to exist in his world. Yet, despite the tension that my grandfather's presence brought into our home, my mother's love for me never wavered. Even in her silence, she showed her support in small, unnoticed ways. She would rub my back at night when I cried, and even when my father was absent, she did everything she could to provide a sense of normalcy for me. But normalcy, under the constant gaze of my grandfather, was a fragile illusion. It was impossible to maintain the image of a happy family when the air was always thick with fear and control. One of the most painful lessons I learned during those years was that sometimes love isn't enough. As much as I wanted my mother to fight for me, to stand up to my grandfather and protect me from his cruelty, I understood that her love was complicated by the years of abuse she had endured. Her submission was not a choice. It was a consequence of the manipulation and fear that had shaped her life. In the years that followed, I began to question whether my mother's role in the family dynamic was one of silent support or silent complicity. I began to see the ways in which her fear held her captive, and how, in trying to protect us from my grandfather, she had unknowingly allowed him to continue his reign of terror. But as I got older, I also began to understand that survival takes many forms. My mother's choice to remain silent, to endure, was her way of holding the family together in the only way she knew how. It wasn't the perfect solution, and it wasn't the right solution, but it was the solution she had. And it was only later, as I began to find my own voice, that I truly understood the complexity of her actions and the sacrifices she made for the family she loved. As I look back now, I see that my mother's journey was one of survival just like mine. She fought her own battles, not always in ways that made sense to me, but always with a heart full of love. And in the end, it was that love that carried us both through the darkest days. But the question remained, could I break free from the shadows of my family's past? Or would I too become a silent witness to my own suffering? Little did I know that the path ahead would be even more complicated, but it was one that would ultimately lead to my own liberation and to the discovery of my true strength. The journey of discovering my own voice had begun, but the real test was just ahead. It didn't take long for the initial fear and respect I had for my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, to turn into something much darker. As a child, I had seen him as a figure of strength and discipline, someone who commanded respect with his mere presence. His military bearing, his sharp words, and the way he carried himself had always given me the impression that he was untouchable, a force of nature that nothing could shake. But slowly over time that image began to crack, and I began to see the man behind the uniform, a man whose control had become more suffocating, more dangerous. At first, his behavior was simply a matter of strict rules. Everything in our home had to be in its place, from the books on the shelf to the plates on the table. The smallest imperfection would trigger a harsh critique from him. He wasn't one to show affection. Instead, he taught us that love was shown through discipline, through strength, through following the rules. And for a while that seemed like enough. My mother, always eager to please, worked hard to meet his impossible standards, constantly trying to earn his approval. I too tried to adapt, thinking that if I followed the rules and performed well enough, I might somehow earn his approval, or at least avoid his wrath. But as time passed, I began to notice a subtle shift. The criticisms that once felt like mere corrections now came with a weight that made me feel like I was constantly under surveillance. My grandfather's visits, once something I could handle, began to fill me with dread. He was no longer just a stern authority figure. He was becoming something far more unpredictable. The sharpness in his gaze, the coldness of his voice, and the way he would examine everything around him, all of it started to feel like a tightening noose, slowly strangling the life from our home. I remember one particular evening when my grandfather's behavior took a terrifying turn. It was a Sunday, and as usual, he came to visit us for dinner. My mother had spent the whole day preparing a meal that she knew would meet his expectations. Roast chicken with potatoes, a simple but elegant dish. But this time, something about the way he looked at the food made my stomach churn. After a few bites, he slammed his hand down on the table, making all of us jump. "This is unacceptable, Martha," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The chicken is dry." "I don't eat dry chicken. How can you call this a proper meal?" His eyes were burning with an intensity that made my mother shrink back, her face pale with embarrassment. My father, as usual, said nothing, merely staring at his plate. My mother, who had always done her best to keep everything perfect, looked like she was about to collapse. "I'm so sorry, Augustus. I'll make it better next time," she stammered, her voice trembling. But my grandfather was unmoved. "Next time? There's no next time, Martha. A person who doesn't take care of the details doesn't deserve to be respected." He turned his gaze on me. "And you, Teresa, you need to learn discipline. Your handwriting is sloppy. Your room is a mess. If you want to grow up to be someone, you must learn to keep things in order." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. His words, which once seemed like mere instructions, were now cutting into me like a sharp knife. The weight of his disapproval felt crushing, and the growing sense of fear made it impossible to breathe. It wasn't just the harsh words that started to unsettle me, it was the way he started to act when he was drinking. On more than one occasion, I saw the colonel take a drink of whiskey during dinner, and with each glass, his behavior became more erratic. The man who once seemed so composed, so in control, now seemed unhinged, as though the alcohol loosened some dark, uncontrollable part of him. His eyes, once cold and calculating, would grow glassy and wild, and his temper would flare over the smallest things. I can remember the night he came home particularly drunk, having spent the entire evening at the local VFW hall with some of his military friends. My mother had tried to warn me, but I could tell she didn't know how to handle him anymore. He walked into the house with his usual sharp, authoritative manner, but the drunkenness that had seeped into his veins was unmistakable. "What is this, Samuel?" he demanded, slamming his hand down on the kitchen counter. My father, who had always been a quiet, obedient man in his presence, didn't speak a word, but the tension in the room was palpable. I could feel my body shaking as I watched my grandfather glare at everything in sight: the kitchen, the living room, my mother, and finally, me. "You've become weak, Samuel," he spat. "Your wife can't even make a proper meal, and your daughter can't even write a simple sentence without making mistakes. What kind of man are you to let this happen?" That night, the anger in his voice and the venom in his words felt different. There was something darker about it, something that made me feel as though his authority could easily slip into violence. I could sense that we were no longer safe in the house we had once felt comfortable in. The next morning, the smell of whiskey still clung to the air, and my grandfather's behavior had only worsened. It wasn't just about control anymore, it was about power. It was about him imposing his will on everyone around him, no matter the cost. The calm and measured man who had first entered our lives was becoming a man who didn't hesitate to use fear and intimidation as tools to bend us to his will. Looking back, I realize now that my grandfather wasn't just a man who wanted order. He was a man who craved control, who needed to feel superior to everyone else, and who was willing to use his power to keep others beneath him. This was the turning point in my understanding of him. This was when I saw that the man I had once looked up to as a figure of strength was, in fact, a man whose authority was built on the suffering of others. And though I didn't know it at the time, that was the moment I began to understand the true nature of abuse. It wasn't just about physical violence, it was about control, manipulation, and the slow, insidious erosion of one's sense of self. And it was in that moment that I knew I would have to find a way out of the suffocating grip of my grandfather's influence. As I continued to live under his shadow, I began to see more clearly the cracks in the foundation of our family. The truth was becoming undeniable. My grandfather's authority had begun to warp and distort everything around him, and nothing would ever be the same again. But what I didn't yet understand was how much this realization would shape the choices I would have to make in the years to come. And so, as I stood at the edge of this new reality, I couldn't help but wonder what my next step would be. Could I escape the shadow of my grandfather? Could I reclaim my life, my voice, and my freedom from the suffocating power that held us all captive? The first signs of change were subtle, like the quiet rustling of a storm brewing far off on the horizon, just out of sight. I remember the summer evenings when the sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills of Lexington, Kentucky, and we'd sit outside, my parents and I, listening to the crickets and the faint hum of distant cars. It was peaceful, warm, and full of the comforting sounds of our small, simple life. But over time, something started to shift, and that peace began to feel fragile, as though the ground beneath us was slowly cracking. It all started after Colonel Augustus Forest began to visit more regularly. At first, his visits felt like nothing more than the strict, disapproving eyes of a father trying to ensure that his son, Samuel, was living up to the family name. There were the weekly Sunday dinners, the critical eye on every dish my mother served, the compliments laced with biting undertones. Everything about him screamed control, and it seemed harmless at first. He was just a man who wanted order, at least, that's what I told myself. But as time passed, the control turned into something more insidious, more dangerous. My mother, once a confident and loving figure in our home, started to wither in front of us. The woman who used to laugh freely as she cooked or hummed while tending the garden became a shadow of herself. Every time the colonel came over, she would brace herself, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the meals, her eyes darting nervously toward the door whenever she heard his footsteps. She seemed to fear him, though I never understood why, not at first. He was her father-in-law, after all. Shouldn't she feel safe with him? But no, his presence turned our home into a tense battlefield, and I could see it. Every little gesture, every forced smile she gave, was a plea for approval, as though her entire worth rested on his judgment. I began to notice changes in my father as well. The man who had once been steady and firm in his decisions, who would always play the role of protector and provider, began to shrink in the face of his father's authority. At first, he would nod in agreement with every command the colonel issued, even if it made him uncomfortable. But as the colonel's visits grew more frequent, so did his criticisms. "Samuel, you're failing your family," he would mutter. "Your wife can't even make a proper meal. Your daughter is too undisciplined." Every word felt like a lash, and my father, instead of standing up to his father, would just take it, retreating into himself, a hushed version of the man I had once known. It was in the small moments of tension, the moments after the colonel would leave, that I started to feel the full weight of what was happening to us. My mother would quietly wipe away a tear when she thought no one was looking, but she would never say anything. She never argued, never spoke up, just accepted it as part of life. Samuel would sink into his chair, exhausted, and quietly sip his drink, avoiding any conversation about the colonel's harsh words. There was a silence that would fall over our house after each visit, a quiet despair that seemed to settle into our bones. But the true shift came one night when the colonel stayed longer than usual. After the Sunday dinner, we gathered in the living room as we always did, and my father sat there with a strained smile, trying to pretend that everything was okay. I remember looking at him then, the weariness in his eyes, the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass. The colonel sat across from him, eyes hard as ever, talking about politics and discipline, his voice booming with the kind of certainty only someone who had been in power for too long could have. He turned to me at one point, staring at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "You need to learn, Teresa." he said, his voice sharp. A forest doesn't bow down. A forest doesn't break. The words sent a chill through me, but I tried to brush it off. It was just his way of speaking, I told myself. But there was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment would mark the beginning of a much darker chapter in my life. That evening, as I was heading to bed, I overheard my parents in the next room. They were whispering, but I could hear the tension in their voices. My mother was asking my father if we could leave, if we could get away from the colonel. She was scared of what he might do next. But my father, as he always did, reassured her that we couldn't leave. He couldn't leave his father, the man who held so much power in the town, the man who could ruin us all with a single word. In that moment, I understood that we were all trapped by the very man who had once seemed like nothing more than a strict but caring grandfather. The colonel's presence, his need for control, was now suffocating us. It was no longer just about discipline. It was about fear, about making us live in constant anticipation of his next move. Looking back now, I realize how dangerous this kind of control can be. At the time, I thought it was just the way things were. I thought it was normal for families to be run like a military unit, for love to be laced with criticism and authority. But now I know that love should never be conditional, never bound by fear or intimidation. The lesson I learned from this part of my life was one that took me years to fully understand. When control becomes the focus of a relationship, love becomes a weapon, and the person you love the most becomes the one who holds the power to hurt you the most. My mother, my father, and I were all caught in a web of manipulation that we couldn't escape from, not yet. But that night, in the silence that followed, I felt something shift inside of me. I realized that something had to change. And little did I know that change would come sooner than I thought. As I lay in bed that night, I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the windows. I could hear my parents' quiet voices, the gentle hum of their conversation. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that there could be a way out of this, a way to reclaim our family, our home, and our lives. But that would be a journey I could never have imagined, a journey that would take me down paths I never expected. It's a curious thing, fear. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's a whisper, a creeping sensation that builds slowly over time, like a shadow that stretches across the floor without you even noticing. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, I can see how fear took hold of my childhood, especially when my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, was around. The colonel was a man who commanded respect, and not in the way that people who are kind and worthy of admiration do. He commanded it through his sheer presence, the stiffness of his posture, the coldness in his eyes, the rigid way he spoke, and above all, the sense that everything he did had a purpose: to control, to dominate, to impose his will. He was always in charge, and everyone knew it. At first, his presence in our home felt like an inconvenience, a temporary visitor who made my father shrink in ways I couldn't understand. My father, Samuel, was a man I'd always admired, gentle, patient, kind. He was a good man, a man who took pride in the simple life he had built with my mother. But when his father, the colonel, came around, he became a shell of himself, his shoulders sagging, his voice trembling. The psychological weight the colonel placed on us was invisible but heavy. It wasn't the loud commands or the obvious signs of physical abuse that left a mark on me. It was the way he made us feel small, unworthy, and constantly on edge. I could see it in my father's eyes whenever the colonel was around. There was fear there, not the kind that came from a child being scolded, but a grown man afraid of disappointing his father, a man who had been trained to always obey, always comply. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but my father's relationship with his father was deeply fraught. It was as if the colonel was trying to break my father's spirit, bit by bit, and he did it through constant criticism, belittling remarks, and an unrelenting expectation that no matter how hard Samuel tried, it was never enough. The same behavior he showed my father, he started showing me. Only his focus shifted more to me as I grew older. I remember one day I was sitting in the living room, my legs crossed on the couch, reading a book, when the colonel walked in without knocking, his heavy boots echoing across the hardwood floor. He was always dressed in his military uniform, impeccably pressed, the smell of aftershave and whiskey clinging to him like a shroud. The air in the room instantly changed, becoming stifling, full of tension. "Teresa," he said, his voice like a slow-moving river of ice. "What are you reading?" "Fairy tales, I suppose." I lowered the book slightly, looking up at him, my heart racing. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it was never good. "Yes, sir," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't tell me you want to grow up to be one of those silly princesses," he said, his eyes narrowing. "A girl should learn something useful. Do you want to be a teacher like your mother's friends? Or will you settle for a life of mediocrity?" I didn't respond, not knowing how. His words stung, but I wasn't about to show him how much. I simply nodded, pretending to continue reading. I couldn't argue with him, and I knew better than to disagree. But the damage was already done. Those words, though seemingly small, planted a seed of doubt in my mind. The Colonel made me feel as though the things I enjoyed, the things that brought me peace, books, dreams, even the small joys of childhood, were worthless, insignificant. And worse, it wasn't just that they were unworthy in his eyes, but that I, by liking them, was somehow failing. Failing him. Failing my family. This kind of psychological abuse, the constant undermining of my worth and potential, was far more insidious than any physical punishment. It left no marks on my skin, but it carved deep wounds into my sense of self. The more I tried to please him, the more I realized that nothing was ever good enough. The fear of disappointing him became all-consuming, and I found myself tiptoeing around him, afraid to speak, afraid to act, afraid to even think too loudly. But what was perhaps the hardest to bear was how my mother reacted to all of this. She too was a victim of the Colonel's control, and she too began to change. The woman I had always seen as my rock, strong, loving, always there, began to withdraw. At first it was subtle. She spoke less, smiled less. But over time the withdrawal became more pronounced. She would spend hours in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she worked, always glancing toward the door, as if waiting for him to arrive. At first I couldn't understand why she didn't stand up to him, why she didn't defend me when he made me feel worthless. It wasn't until much later that I realized she, too, had been broken by years of psychological control. She was afraid of him just as I was, but more tragically, she had come to accept that this was simply how things were. It was in the silence of those moments, those quiet, tense dinners, those whispered conversations when the Colonel wasn't around, that I understood something deep inside me. Fear had become part of our family's DNA. We lived not just in his shadow, but in the shadow of everything he represented. Power, control, and the unspoken promise that to challenge him was to invite punishment, not just for ourselves but for everyone we loved. It was a lesson in submission, one that many families in that time had learned well. But it also taught me something else, something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. I could not let fear define me. Fear had kept me small, had kept me in a box that the Colonel had built around me, and I knew that somehow, in some way, I had to find the strength to break out. As I sat there, listening to my grandfather's voice fill the room, I realized that my journey, my real journey, had just begun. And it would be a long road, filled with self-discovery, courage, and the painful realization that in order to be free, I had to reclaim my sense of self from the man who had sought to strip it away. Little did I know the hardest battles were still ahead. But they were battles I would face, not just for me, but for my family, and for the future I was determined to create. One where I would never again let fear dictate the terms of my life. There are moments in life when something inside us shifts so drastically that we can never go back to who we were before. These moments are sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, but they always mark the point of no return. I learned this the hard way when I came face to face with the true nature of my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forest, and the irreversible changes he brought into our lives. Up until that point, I had lived in fear of my grandfather's presence, that constant tension that hung in the air every time he visited. His rigid discipline, the constant demands for perfection, the subtle and not so subtle threats. These were things I had come to accept as a part of my life. But nothing could have prepared me for the horrifying shift that occurred one evening. A shift that would change everything. Started like any other visit. The Colonel arrived at our home unannounced, his shoes clicking loudly on the wooden floor as he made his way through the door, as if he had the right to inspect everything in his path. My mother, ever the dutiful wife, greeted him with her usual nervous smile, trying to keep the peace. My father, quiet as always when his father was around, stood by the door, barely making eye contact. I could see the strain in his shoulders, the weariness of a man who had spent his whole life trying, and failing to meet his father's impossible expectations. But this time something was different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the book in my hands, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It was when dinner was over, and the colonel was in his usual chair, sipping whiskey from his glass, that the shift began. His eyes, those cold, piercing blue eyes, never left me. It was as if he was studying me, calculating something, and the longer he looked at me, the more I felt a deep, unsettling sense of dread. "Teresa," he called to me, his voice low but commanding. "Come here." I froze. I had learned by then to obey without question, but this time I hesitated. There was something in his tone, something darker than usual, that made my heart race in fear. "Don't make me ask again," he said, and this time the edge in his voice was unmistakable. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling, and walked toward him. My mother's eyes followed me, filled with an unreadable mixture of fear and resignation. She didn't say a word. There was nothing she could say. My father, too, remained silent, his face drawn and pale as he looked at me, his eyes full of helplessness. When I reached him, the colonel motioned for me to sit next to him. I obeyed, but I could feel the coldness radiating from him, the weight of his presence pressing down on me. "You're growing up too fast," he said, his voice oddly soft, but the words felt like a warning. "A girl like you needs to know her place." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He seemed to study me for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed my arm with a force that took me by surprise. "Let me show you what it means to be a woman," he said, his grip tightening as he pulled me closer to him. In that moment, the world around me seemed to stop. Everything went silent, and the only sound I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my chest. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, feel the roughness of his hands as they gripped me. For the first time, I understood just how much power he held over all of us. It wasn't just his physical strength or his rank. It was his ability to break us down, to make us feel small and insignificant, to use our love for him as a weapon against us. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands shaking as she gripped the frame. For a brief moment our eyes met, and I saw the look of pure terror in hers. It was the first time I had ever seen her so afraid, so broken. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized that I could not live like this anymore. I couldn't let this man control me any longer, and I couldn't allow him to destroy what little peace my family had left. But the choice I had to make was not easy. It was a choice between survival and rebellion, between staying in a situation that was slowly killing me or fighting back, no matter the cost. Before I could even fully process what I was about to do, my father spoke. His voice, though quiet, carried a weight of authority that I hadn't heard in years. "Augustus, stop," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "You're crossing a line. This isn't right." For a brief moment, the colonel's eyes flashed with anger. The tension in the room was unbearable. But then, just as quickly, his expression softened, as if the anger had drained from him, leaving only cold indifference. He released me with a forceful shove and stood up, his face red with frustration. "You've ruined her, Samuel," he muttered, his voice thick with anger. "You've ruined everything." And just like that, he was gone. He left the room without another word, his heavy footsteps fading as he walked out the door. I was left in a daze, my body trembling with fear and confusion. But in that moment, I knew something fundamental had shifted inside me. I had seen the true nature of the man I had feared for so long. And I knew that, for my own survival, I had to break free from his grip. It wasn't just about standing up to him. It was about taking control of my own life, reclaiming my dignity, and finding the strength to protect myself and my family. But that moment of defiance would come at a great cost, and the road ahead would be one of pain, loss, and unimaginable choices. The truth was, I had crossed the point of no return. There was no going back to the way things were before. From that night on, my life would never be the same. In the next chapter, I will share with you the consequences of that decision, the choices I had to make, the battles I had to fight, and the ultimate price of freedom. But for now, all I could do was sit there in the silence, knowing that I had stepped into a new world, one where survival and courage would be the only things that mattered. There are moments in life when courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about acting despite the fear. For me, the moment of escape wasn't a sudden heroic burst of bravery, but a quiet, slow realization that I could not stay trapped in the life that had been forced upon me. It was a decision I had to make for myself, one that I didn't fully understand at the time, but one that would set me on a path toward freedom. The days after my grandfather's brutal outburst left me shaken, but they also planted a seed in my heart, one that had been dormant for far too long. I had lived in fear for years, never truly questioning my fate. My grandfather's power had always seemed absolute, and my parents' silent acceptance of it made it feel like there was no way out. But in the days that followed that terrifying night, something began to shift inside me. I realized that I had a choice, no matter how small, no matter how terrifying that choice might be. My mother, though often quiet and submissive to my grandfather's will, had started to show signs of rebellion. It was subtle, but I noticed it. She began to speak out more, challenging him even in small ways. The first time she did it, I was stunned. She had always been the obedient wife, the one who didn't rock the boat. But that night, when my grandfather arrived unannounced, she told him in no uncertain terms that we weren't going to tolerate his visits anymore. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was a statement of intent. She wasn't ready to stand up to him outright, but she was beginning to make her own quiet stand. Her courage in that moment became my own. It was as if a spark of hope had been lit in both of us, and it set something in motion that neither of us could have predicted. Yet, even with that new flicker of hope, the reality of our situation was daunting. The fear of angering my grandfather, of facing his wrath, was still ever present. He had always been a shadow over our lives, casting his cold, judgmental gaze on everything we did. The thought of confronting him, of doing anything that might make him angry, paralyzed me. But the longer I lived under his roof, the more I saw the cracks in his armor. His power wasn't infinite. And that realization, even in its painful slowness, became the foundation for my escape. The hardest part of making that decision wasn't the fear of the colonel, it was the fear of leaving my family behind. My father, in his quiet submission, seemed to be lost in the same cycle of powerlessness that my mother had been trapped in for years. The idea of leaving him, even if it meant breaking free from the abuse, felt like abandoning the person who should have protected me. But over time, I began to see that my escape wasn't about leaving him, it was about saving myself, and in doing so, giving myself a chance to protect those who still mattered. The decision to leave was never easy. It came in small moments, building up like drops of water that slowly wore away a stone. One afternoon, after one of my grandfather's longer visits, when the air in the house felt suffocating with the weight of his silent judgment, I found myself standing by the window, staring out into the world beyond. The rain was falling, the trees swaying in the wind, but all I could see was the life I was leading. The life that felt like it would swallow me whole if I didn't act. I looked back at my mother, sitting quietly in the living room, pretending to read. She didn't meet my gaze, she couldn't. She had been worn down by years of silence. I wanted to say something to her, to ask her to come with me, but I knew I had to do this on my own. My escape wasn't just about running away, it was about stepping into my own life, claiming the future that had been stolen from me. Later that night, after my mother had gone to bed and the house had fallen into that heavy silence that always preceded my grandfather's drunken visits, I stood in the middle of my room, trembling, heart pounding. I had no plan, no real escape route. All I knew was that I had to leave. The decision had been made. I grabbed my small satchel, the one I used for school, and stuffed it with the few things I could take with me: a change of clothes, my favorite book, a letter from my father that had always brought me comfort. I paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the choice I was about to make. My heart raced, but my mind was clear. This was it. I crept out of the room, down the hallway through the back door. My mother didn't wake up, and my grandfather was nowhere to be found. I moved quickly, silently, as though I might be caught at any moment. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped into the backyard. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was taking control of my own destiny. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with fear, and I didn't know what would come next. But I knew one thing: I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep living in the suffocating grip of my grandfather's control. The courage I found that night was not just about running away, it was about reclaiming my life, one step at a time. As I walked down the dark street, I thought about everything I had left behind: the house, the family, the life I had known. And though the path ahead was unknown, I knew I was no longer running from something. I was running toward something better, toward a future that was mine to create. In the next chapter, I will share the challenges I faced after I left and how I navigated the world outside of the control I had lived under for so long. But for now, I knew that this moment, the moment of escape, was the first step toward rebuilding a life I could call my own. And that was enough. The road to safety and healing is never a straight line. It's not a smooth path where every step forward feels like a triumph. In fact, it's often a series of small, uncertain steps that lead us out of darkness, each one a little victory, even if we don't realize it at the time. For me, after the escape, every day felt like a new chapter, one I had to write for myself, one where I no longer had to live in fear of the monsters from my past. The first step was finding safety. I didn't have a plan when I left that night, but I knew I couldn't go back. I walked for hours, not knowing where to go, but I ended up at the doorstep of a neighbor, Mrs. Judith, who lived a few houses down from us. She was an older woman, the kind of neighbor who always had a kind word or a plate of cookies to offer, and I'd always felt a quiet connection to her. That night, as the rain fell in sheets and my body trembled with both fear and exhaustion, she opened the door with a concerned look in her eyes. "Oh, Teresa," she said, pulling me into her warm embrace. "You're safe now. Don't you worry about a thing. You're staying here with me." Mrs. Judith took me in without question, without hesitation, and that was the first moment in what felt like an eternity that I knew I was no longer alone. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the simple act of kindness, a safe place to stay, a warm meal, and someone who cared, was enough to begin my healing. In those first few weeks, I had to learn to trust again. Trusting others had always been difficult, especially after everything I'd endured with my grandfather and the fear I'd lived under for so long. The people around me, my mother, the community, even Mrs. Judith had all been complicit in one way or another, either through silence or fear. But now in the warmth of Mrs. Judith's home, I started to let my guard down, just a little bit at a time. Every conversation we had, every small act of kindness, helped to chip away at the walls I had built around my heart. But safety was just the beginning. Healing, I soon learned, wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't like flipping a switch or waking up one day feeling whole again. Healing was a journey, a process that took time, patience, and a willingness to confront the pain that I had buried deep inside. I started with therapy. For the first time in my life, I spoke to someone about the things I had been through. It wasn't easy, and I found myself breaking down more times than I could count, but each session brought me closer to understanding the impact of my grandfather's abuse and my mother's silence. I had spent years thinking that I was broken, that I was the problem, but talking to a professional helped me realize something important. I wasn't broken. What had been done to me wasn't my fault. In time, I began to rediscover who I was outside of the role my family had forced me to play. I found solace in small things, reading, journaling, walking through the park near Mrs. Judith's house. I had always loved reading as a child, and now as an adult, it became a way for me to escape into different worlds, places where I wasn't afraid and where I could imagine a life of peace. I also took up a job at a local diner, a place where I could interact with people outside of my past. It was a humble job, but it helped me feel like I was part of something new, something that wasn't tainted by the memories of the past. And the customers, though they didn't know my story, treated me with kindness. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being seen for who I was, Teresa, not the granddaughter of a man who had destroyed everything in his path, but a person who deserved a chance at a normal life. The road wasn't always easy. There were setbacks. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I'd ever be free of the memories that haunted me. I had flashbacks, nightmares, and the feeling that I would never truly be rid of the shadows of my past. But as time passed, I learned to let go of the guilt. I learned that healing didn't mean erasing the past, it meant learning to live with it, to integrate it into my story without letting it define me. Perhaps the most difficult part of this journey was learning to forgive. Not just others, but myself. I had carried the weight of my past for so long that I had forgotten how to forgive the girl who had lived through those experiences. I had to remind myself that I was not the cause of the pain I had endured. I wasn't responsible for the actions of my grandfather, nor was I responsible for the life my mother had chosen. I had to learn to accept my past as part of my story without letting it control me. Looking back, I realized that my journey of rebuilding my life was not just about survival, it was about reclaiming my power, piece by piece. It was about finding the courage to rebuild a life that I could be proud of, even after everything had been torn apart. In the next part of my story, I'll share how I began to find my voice again, how I learned to trust people, and, eventually, how I opened my heart to love once more. But for now, I know that my healing, while a continuous process, has already brought me to a place of strength I never imagined I could reach. And that, my dear friends, is a victory in itself. There are moments in life when the past, no matter how far you try to bury it, rises to the surface. For years, I had lived with the burden of my grandfather's actions, the weight of my own silence, and the unspoken fears that kept me from moving forward. But healing, as I learned, doesn't come from running away from the truth. It comes from confronting it head-on. And confronting the past, as painful as it may be, is the first step in truly setting yourself free. It all began on an ordinary afternoon in the spring of 1972. I had been living with Mrs. Judith for several months by then, steadily rebuilding my life. I had found work at a local diner and had even made a few friends. Life was quiet, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was beginning to understand what it meant to live without fear. But it wasn't until that day that I realized how deeply my past still affected me. I had just finished a shift at the diner when I returned to Mrs. Judith's house and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands. The letter was old, yellowed with age, and it was addressed to me. The moment I saw it, I felt my heart drop. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. It was from my mother. But why had she sent it now, after so many years? With trembling hands, I sat down at the table across from Mrs. Judith, the weight of that letter hanging over me. "It's time, Teresa," Mrs. Judith said softly, her eyes kind but steady. "You've been through so much. You deserve to know the truth." I opened the letter slowly, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. My mother's words were simple but filled with the gravity of a lifetime's worth of regret. She wrote about how the truth had always been buried beneath layers of shame and fear, how she had lived in a constant state of survival, just like I had. She spoke about the decision she had made years ago to stay with my grandfather, to stay silent, even when she knew what was happening behind closed doors. She acknowledged the role she had played in the cycles of abuse and control, but she also expressed her deepest apologies. It was the hardest thing I had ever read. The words burned into me, each sentence a reminder of the things I had lived through, and yet somehow they also offered a kind of release. For years, I had blamed myself for not speaking out, for not doing more to stop the cruelty. But in that moment, I realized that my mother, too, had been trapped. She had been caught in the same web of fear, control, and manipulation just as I had. And while that didn't absolve her, it gave me the understanding I needed to stop carrying the burden of blame. As I sat there digesting her words, a wave of emotions swept over me. Anger, sadness, relief, and something I hadn't expected: compassion. I had spent so many years angry at her for not protecting me, for not standing up to my grandfather, for not being the mother I needed. But in reading her letter, I saw a different side of the story. I saw a woman who had been broken, a woman who had made decisions out of survival, a woman who, in her own way, had tried to shield me from the horrors she couldn't escape. That day, I made the decision to confront the past, not just to forgive but to understand it. I decided that it was time to stop running from the truth and start accepting it as part of my story. It wasn't easy and it didn't happen overnight, but in that letter, I found a key to unlock the chains that had kept me bound to a life of fear and shame. I called my mother shortly after reading the letter. We hadn't spoken in years and I wasn't sure what to expect. But when I heard her voice on the other end of the line, I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I could finally speak the truth aloud. We talked for hours, sharing our pain, our regrets, and our hopes for the future. It wasn't a perfect conversation, and it certainly didn't erase the past, but it was a start. That night, I sat alone in my room, reflecting on everything that had been said. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. The truth, no matter how painful, had set something free inside me. I realized that by confronting the past, I could finally begin to heal in a way I never thought possible. In the following weeks, I began to notice changes in myself. I started to open up more, to allow myself to feel emotions I had spent so long burying. I cried, I laughed, and I even allowed myself to dream again, something I hadn't done in a long time. The weight of my grandfather's cruelty, my mother's silence, and my own guilt had begun to lift, and in its place, I started to see the possibility of a life filled with peace, love, and most importantly, healing. But the journey wasn't over. The past would always be a part of me, but I had learned that it didn't define who I was or who I could become. And so, as I sat in Mrs. Judith's kitchen that night, feeling a quiet strength rise within me, I knew that the road ahead was still uncertain, but it was mine to walk. And no matter what came next, I was no longer afraid of facing it. In the next chapter of my story, I will share how I began to rebuild my life, how I found hope in places I least expected, and how the power of healing can transform even the darkest past into a future full of promise. But for now, I held on to one simple truth. Confronting the past was the first step toward reclaiming my future, and that was a journey worth taking. Forgiveness is one of the hardest, yet most powerful acts we can offer in our lifetime. It is not about forgetting the hurt or the pain we've experienced, but about choosing to free ourselves from the hold that past wounds have over us. For years, I carried the burden of my past, my grandfather's cruelty, my mother's silence, the years I spent in fear and uncertainty. But as I grew older, I came to realize that the path to healing was not through holding on to resentment, but through forgiveness, first of others and then of myself. In the months following the letter from my mother and the conversations that followed, I began to understand what true forgiveness really meant. It wasn't about excusing the harm done to me or pretending that everything was okay. It was about choosing to stop letting those painful memories control my life. I had spent so long living with anger, bitterness, and confusion, not realizing that holding on to those emotions only continued to harm me. Forgiveness, I learned, is as much for the person doing the forgiving as it is for the one being forgiven. I remember the first time I truly felt the power of forgiveness. It was a quiet evening, and I was sitting on the porch of Mrs. Judith's house, the sun slowly setting behind the trees. I had just received a letter from my mother, one she had written months ago but only now found the strength to send. She apologized for her role in the pain I had suffered, and in her words, I could feel the sorrow of a woman who had been carrying her own burdens for far too long. Reading those words was like a weight lifting from my chest. For so long, I had blamed her for not protecting me, for not standing up to my grandfather, for letting me endure the torment I had faced. But as I read her letter, I saw her through a new lens. I understood her fear, her pain, and the choices she had made out of survival. I saw that, in her own way, she had been trapped just as I had been. That night, I sat with her on the phone, and for the first time I told her I forgave her. It wasn't easy. It didn't erase the years of hurt, but it allowed me to let go of the anger that had been holding me hostage. It was freeing in a way I hadn't anticipated. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving someone of their actions. It was about reclaiming my own peace. It was about setting myself free from the past so that I could finally move forward. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a one-time event. It's a process, a commitment to healing. Over time, I began to see my mother not as the woman who failed to protect me, but as a woman who had been fighting her own battles in her own way. We slowly rebuilt our relationship, one conversation at a time, each one more honest and open than the last. She too was healing. But there was another part of this journey I hadn't expected: forgiving myself. For so long, I had carried the belief that I was somehow complicit in the abuse I endured, that I could have done more, that I should have spoken up, that I should have been stronger. These thoughts haunted me, especially in the quiet moments when I found myself alone with my thoughts. But over time, I came to understand that none of it was my fault. I was a child trapped in a situation I couldn't control, trying to survive the only way I knew how. And in forgiving myself, I found the freedom to begin anew. I learned through my own journey that healing is not linear. It doesn't follow a neat, predictable path. There were days when I felt like I was moving forward, and days when the past would creep back into my mind, reminding me of the wounds I thought were healed. But with every step, I grew stronger. I realized that healing comes not from erasing the past, but from learning to live with it, to let it shape you into a more resilient person. One of the most important lessons I've learned in this journey is that breaking the cycle of trauma requires us to actively choose a different path. It's easy to slip into the patterns we know, to let fear and anger dictate our lives. But true healing comes when we make the conscious decision to break free from those patterns, to choose love, understanding, and most of all, forgiveness. As I look back on my journey, I see how far I've come. From the terrified little girl in a house filled with fear, to the woman who can now speak openly about her pain without being consumed by it. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live without the constant weight of anger, fear, and regret. It means giving ourselves permission to heal, to move on, and to embrace a future that's no longer defined by the past. And so, with the lessons of forgiveness and healing in my heart, I continue on my journey. The road hasn't been easy, and I know there will be more challenges ahead. But now I walk that road with the strength of knowing that forgiveness, of others and of myself, has been the key to breaking the cycle of pain and finding peace. And that is the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. In the next chapter, I will share how I continued to rebuild my life, and how I began to find joy in the smallest of moments, something I had long forgotten. But for now, I carry with me the knowledge that even the darkest nights give way to the brightest days, and that healing, though difficult, is always possible. As I sit on this old porch, surrounded by the familiar scent of freshly cut grass and the soft hum of life around me, I can't help but reflect on the long and difficult journey that has brought me to this moment. My story, filled with pain, fear, survival, and healing, is one that many may find hard to believe. But it is my truth, and through it, I've come to understand just how much strength resides within each of us, even in the darkest of times. The road to healing, as I've learned, is never easy. It's not a straight path, nor is it one that is ever truly finished. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs when we least expect it, testing our will, our resolve, and our ability to rise above. Yet, through every obstacle, every setback, and every heartbreak, I've come to realize something important. We are never as broken as we think we are, and it is through love that we can find the strength to rebuild ourselves. My journey began in the quiet streets of Lexington, Kentucky, as a little girl who couldn't understand the weight of the world around her. It was a time when everything seemed simple, a life filled with the everyday comforts of family and home. But those simple years were suddenly overshadowed by a chain of events that would change the course of my life forever. My grandfather's arrival, the cruel way he instilled fear in our household, and the slow unraveling of my childhood were the start of a long and painful journey. Yet, even in the most dire of circumstances, I learned something powerful. Survival doesn't mean simply enduring. It means finding a way to thrive, even when the odds seem impossible. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that strength doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from facing it head-on, from allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, and then choosing to rise above it. When my grandfather crossed the line, when his actions left scars that would last a lifetime, I could have chosen to let it define me. I could have become bitter, angry, and consumed by the trauma that I endured. But instead, I chose to find healing. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted my ability to ever be whole again. But each small victory, each step I took toward forgiveness, helped me piece together the broken parts of myself. I learned that true healing doesn't happen overnight. It requires patience, understanding, and the courage to face the parts of ourselves that we've kept hidden for far too long. It requires love, not just the love we receive from others, but the love we give ourselves, the acceptance of who we are despite our flaws, our scars, and our mistakes. For so long, I struggled with the idea that I wasn't worthy of love, that my past would forever haunt me. But over time, I realized that it was through love, both from others and from within, that I found my strength. It was love that healed the wounds that had been inflicted upon me. It was love that allowed me to forgive, to move on, and to rebuild the life I deserved. Love, as I've come to understand, is not always easy. It's not always a fairy tale or a perfect picture. Love, real love, is messy, complicated, and sometimes even painful. But it is also redemptive. It is the force that pushes us forward when we think we cannot go any further. It is the force that allows us to face our past, embrace it, and then let it go. And it is through love that I was able to rebuild the life I have now, one full of hope, of purpose, and of new beginnings. As I sit here today watching my grandchildren run through the garden, laughter filling the air, I see a future that is bright. A future where the darkness of my past no longer has a hold on me. I see a future where the love I've received, the strength I've found within myself, and the lessons I've learned along the way are passed down to the next generation. They will not carry the burden that I once did. They will know love without fear, hope without hesitation, and resilience without limits. This life of mine, shaped by both the good and the bad, is a testament to the power of transformation. It is a reminder that no matter how hard life may seem, there is always a way to change, to grow, and to heal. There is always a chance for a new beginning, and perhaps most importantly, there is always strength within us, even when we feel like we have nothing left to give. So to anyone out there who may be struggling, to anyone who feels lost in the weight of their past, know this: you are stronger than you think. You have the power to change your story, to rewrite your narrative, and to find the love and healing you deserve. It will take time and it will take courage, but it is possible. If I can do it, so can you. As I close this chapter of my story, I am filled with gratitude for the life I've lived, for the lessons I've learned, and for the love that has transformed me. My journey is far from over, but it is one that I will walk with grace, with hope, and with the knowledge that the best is yet to come.